Hi everyone, I'm going to read to you The Dorset Dumpling and the Budgerigar, which is by Kay Ennals. You can see it's a very well loved book from my childhood, so let's have a read. You may remember that the Dorset dumpling was a very special dumpling. He came into the world like this. Mrs. Merry, who lived with her husband in a dear little cottage set among the Dorset hills, was famous throughout Dorset for making delicious dumplings. She would never tell anyone how she made the dumplings. She used a secret recipe handed down by her grandmother. The recipe had a magic ingredient. On one of her baking days, she must have used too much of the magic ingredient because one of her dumplings came to life. He opened his big brown eyes and looked at her. Mrs. Merry was amazed and delighted. She called to her husband, "Quickly, come and see the most wonderful dumpling I have ever made. This is a real Dorset dumpling. I'm going to call him Dee for short." Dee made Mr. and Mrs. Merry laugh by rolling about on the kitchen floor. One day he rolled right out of the kitchen, through the kitchen door and into the Dorset countryside, and this is when his adventures begin. It was a lazy summer day with bees buzzing about, birds resting in the trees and cats snoozing, curled up in their favourite places. A small furry figure, not looking lazy at all, was almost dancing along as he made his way towards the top of a Purbeck hill. The Dorset dumpling was his usual happy self. He had been with some friends, Auntie Lil and two of her children, Sarah and Tammy, for a day's outing to a very large pool where the Dorset hills folded down to the sea. Well, it wasn't exactly a pool, because he could see an entrance between the rocks when the sea came in. Auntie Lil had called the pool a cove. What had she called it? Woolworth Cove? Anyway, it was something like that, but he knew he hadn't got the name exactly right. He always found new words difficult. As they were walking round the pool, he saw a road leading upwards out of the cove. "I'd like to find out where that road goes to," he shouted to his friends, who were a little way behind. "All right, Dee," they called back. "We know you like exploring." He started off, waving to them as he left the cove. Dee knew there must be miles and miles of Dorset countryside that he had not yet seen. He continued following the road. As he neared the top of the hill, small gardens fronted the houses that were either side of the road. He knew from the feeling inside him that another adventure might start here. His excitement grew. Further along the road, parked alongside the pavement, was a large removal van. Two men wearing red aprons were going backwards and forwards between a house and a van. They were carrying chairs, boxes, beds and rolls of carpet, and the van was almost full. The Dorset dumpling stopped and stared. What were the men doing? He waved to them. One of the men shouted to the other, "Come on, Fred, get a move on." Fred came out of the house carrying a large bookcase. He struggled to lift it into the van. "You'll have to get the other end, Jim," Fred told him. "It's too much for me." Together, Fred and Jim lifted the bookcase to the only large space left in the van. Wiping the perspiration off their faces, they noticed the little furry fellow watching. Fred spoke first. "If you want a job like this, Sonny, you'll have to build your muscles up. What's your name?" "I'm the Dorset dumpling, but everyone calls me Dee." "Dee? That's unusual," Jim joined in. "We're just going to have a rest from loading, so let's all sit down and you can tell us where you came from." Dee told them, "I've just come from Woolworth Cove down there," he pointed. "My friends are still there. We're on a day's outing." Jim laughed. "See, Fred, he's got a new name for the cove." "I used to call it Smuggler's Cove," Fred said. "That's when I was little, like Dee." Fred and Jim flopped down onto the tailboard of the van. Both men were pleased to have a break from work. Fred lifted the little fellow onto the tailboard to sit alongside them. "Will your friends be worried about you?" asked Jim. "No, they know I like exploring." Dee Dee began to tell them of all the places he had been to in Dorset when something yellow and green flew past them into the van. It, whatever it was, hit a mirror and fell onto the settee. Fred, Jim and Dee Dee scrambled up and climbed around the furniture to see what it was. It was a bird. It now lay trembling and exhausted. "Oh, poor bird!" Dee Dee hadn't seen such a beautifully coloured bird before. "Look at that," Fred said in wonderment. "It's a budgie." "It's a budgie, all right." Jim had budgerigars at his home. "It's a beauty, but it's knocked itself out. Well, nearly out." Dee Dee picked up the green and yellow bird and held it gently in his hands. Its eyes were almost closed. Dee Dee had never been so close to a bird before, and he'd certainly never seen a budgie before. He felt its warm body and looked at the shape of its wings. He carefully stroked its head. Curious eyes had been watching from the house. The family, who were moving, now came out to see what was going on. Mr. and Mrs. Wilton and their twin daughters, Lucy and Lucinda, peered into the van. Lucy and Lucinda were very much alike, but Lucy had fair curly hair, and Lucinda had straight hair tied into a ponytail. "Look," Lucinda pointed. "That furry boy is holding a bird in his hands." "In his hands?" echoed Lucy. Dee Dee was still holding the frightened budgie, but he was wishing with all of his might that it would soon be well again. And, as he was a dumpling made from a magic recipe, his wishes very often came true. Fred took it upon himself to explain. "We were just having a bit of a rest, Mr. and Mrs. Wilton, when this little character came along." He pointed to Dee Dee. "Apparently he's known as Dee Dee, the Dorset dumpling. We'd hardly said hello when this budgie flew in." Lucinda and Lucy looked at one another, and they both said, "Can we have the budgie, Daddy? Can we, Mummy?" "If the Dorset dumpling doesn't mind," replied Mummy. She looked for an answer from Dee Dee, who was still holding the budgie with great care. "No, I don't mind, but please call me Dee Dee." "That's kind of you, Dee Dee," Mrs. Wilton smiled, "but someone may have lost a budgie. I'll go and ask around the village to find out." She went straight away. "We'd first better find a cage for it," said Mr. Wilton. "It doesn't look very well, and I'm sure this young man called Dee Dee is getting very tired of holding it." Then he had an idea. "There is an old hamster cage somewhere that we don't use now. Do you know where it would be, Lucy?" "I know," answered Lucinda. "It's in the big cupboard over there." She pointed at a big brown cupboard at the back of the van. "I'll get it," offered Jim. He soon found the hamster cage and a small pot. "I'll fill this with water so that the poor bird can have a drink." They watched Jim take the budgie from Dee Dee and put it into the old hamster cage. Then he took the budgie into the cage, into the house, and into the kitchen. He filled the small pot with water and put that in the cage. They all crowded round. "I'll break a bit of that apple tree if you have in the garden, Mr. Wilton, and the budgie can use it as a perch." Jim knew what budgies needed. He often put small branches of apple tree in the cage of his own budgies for them to perch on. "Yes," Mr. Wilton agreed, "it needs a perch." Jim was soon back with the apple branch which he fixed in the cage. The budgie opened its eyes, saw the perch, and climbed onto it. The cage with the budgie was put on the windowsill in the kitchen. "What shall we call it?" Lucinda spoke very quietly, so as not to frighten the bird. "Oh yes, what shall we call it?" Lucy also spoke quietly. Jim was going out of the door and back to the van. When he heard the twins asking for a name for the budgie, he turned back towards them. "It has a yellow face just like the sun. What about Sunny?" he declared. "Yes," Lucinda and Lucy both smiled and agreed. "Sunny," they said. "Well," Mr. Wilton exclaimed, "the excitement is over. Do you think, Lucy and Lucinda, that you could take your furry friend to the back garden and find a game to play? There's still a lot of packing to be done. Yes, Daddy, Lucinda answered, but we'll stay with the budgie bird first, just to make sure it's all right. Just then, Mrs. Wilton returned. No one in the village has lost a budgie, she told them, so on the way back I stopped at the village shop and bought some budgie seed. Oh, Mummy, you are good. Lucy and Lucinda gave her a big kiss. Now I think you should all go and play. Mrs. Wilton sent them into the garden. What shall we play? Lucinda asked. Shall we play hide and seek? Lucy suggested. What's hide and seek? Dee Dee wanted to know. Lucy and Lucinda both spoke at once, saying, one of us hides and the others have to find where the one is hiding. Dee Dee understood, and soon they were finding each other's hiding places with shouts of, we can see you there. They were getting so noisy that the boy from next door came to see what they were doing. He was carrying his skateboard. Are you playing hide and seek? He asked. Yes, they told him. That's boring. I'll show you what I do. He put the skateboard on the ground, jumped on it, and travelled back down quickly the garden path. Bet you can't do that, he called back. We'd like to try, Lucinda called. Like to try it, Lucy agreed. Lucinda tried it first, but it wasn't long before she wobbled and fell off. Lucy tried to stand on the skateboard, but she wobbled so much she jumped off. I don't like skateboarding, she declared. Adrian thought it was very funny and laughed at them. Told you, thought you couldn't do it. Let our friend Dee Dee have a go, Adrian. Lucinda wanted Dee Dee to join in. He couldn't skateboard, he's too little. Just once, Lucinda pleaded. She didn't like to leave out their new friend. Just once, echoed Lucy. All right then. Adrian put the board down by Dee Dee and added, he'll fall off too. The Dorset dumpling had been watching the skateboarding carefully. He was used to rolling about, and it seemed to him that to roll on a board would be fun. He jumped on the board and went rolling quite happily down the path. It was no trouble to him. But Adrian was a bit annoyed that someone could use his skateboard just as well as he could himself. He picked up the board, saying, I'm going home. Wait, Lucinda called after him. Come and see the budgie Dee Dee found in the van. They all trooped into the kitchen. Sonny had recovered. Dee Dee, Lucinda and Lucy were delighted to see him on the apple perch chattering away. Adrian was still annoyed about the skateboarding. I don't much like birds in cages, he said crossly. I'm going home now. We're moving house today, Lucinda reminded him, and we won't be here tomorrow to play. Where are you going to live? Adrian asked. We're going to live in the big town, Dorchester, Linda told him. At Dorchester, Lucy joined in. It's going to be lovely. We can go to the shops almost every day. Lucinda was very excited. Lovely, Lucy agreed. Are you taking that bird with you? Adrian inquired as they went back into the garden. Oh, yes. He's ours now and we couldn't leave him behind, Lucinda explained. We love him already, Lucy said. He's not really yours. Adrian had a big frown across his face. I'm going to let him out and then he'll be free. With his skateboard under his arm, Adrian ran to the house into the kitchen and opened the cage door. The others had run after him, shouting, No! Adrian, no! But they were too late. Sonny hopped onto the edge of the cage and flew through the kitchen door. Mummy, Mummy! Both Lucinda and Lucy were crying. The Dorset dumpling stood by, not really knowing what to do, but he told them, I'll go into the garden to see if I can find the budgie. He was just in time to see Adrian running really quickly back to his own home. Adrian knew there would be trouble because he'd let Sonny out of the cage. Mrs. Wilton had come into the kitchen and soon realised what the crying was all about. That naughty Adrian, she claimed. Let's all go into the garden to look for Sonny. They all went to every corner of the garden. They searched every bush. Suddenly Lucinda shouted, There he is! She ran to a tree where she thought Sonny was. She began climbing up to the branches. Then, Oh, it happened so quickly. She lost her footing, slithered down the bark of the tree and landed in a heap at the bottom. Dee Dee rushed over to help. Lucinda was crying because something hurt. Mrs. Wilton and Lucy came quickly. Lucy began crying too. "What have you done, darling?" Mrs. Wilton was worried. They all examined Lucinda's wrist, which was swelling up already. "I shall have to take you to casualty at the hospital," Mrs. Wilton decided. "And me," Lucy cried. "I want to come too." "I want Dee Dee to come as well," Lucinda sobbed. "All right," Mrs. Wilton said, trying to calm Lucinda. "We'll all go together in the car." It was the very first time that the Dorset dumpling had been in a hospital. The ladies in uniforms were called nurses. There were many people sitting on chairs in rows. Mrs. Wilton, Lucinda, Lucy, and Dee Dee also sat in a row. In a short while, a nurse called Lucinda's name, and she was taken to a room to see a doctor. The nurse turned to Mrs. Wilton. "Is this the Dorset dumpling?" she asked. Mrs. Wilton said, "Yes, yes it is." "May I take him to the children's ward? He would really cheer them up." "Yes, of course you may," Mrs. Wilton smiled. "I know Dee Dee would love to help." Dee Dee felt very proud. He was taken along a corridor into a lift, and then into a large room with beds. In each bed was either a baby or a little boy or girl. "Look, children," the nurse said quietly. "The Dorset dumpling has come to see you." "Ooh!" the children exclaimed excitedly. They smiled at this cuddly, furry figure and tried to touch him as he walked by them. Dee Dee was so pleased and happy. He jumped up high in the middle of the floor so that everyone could see. "Ooh!" they said again, and clapped and laughed. Dorset dumpling would have stayed longer with them, but the nurse said, "You're an amazing little dumpling. I'll take you back now to Mrs. Wilton. Thank you for making the children feel so much better." In casualty, Linda had had her wrist x-rayed, but no bones were broken. She had stopped crying. Her wrist was bandaged. "Look, Dee Dee. Look, Lucy. It doesn't hurt now." Mrs. Wilton took them all back to the house where everything had been packed. Jim and Fred were ready to drive off. "I nearly caught Sonny," Jim shouted from the front of the van. "I thought I'd got him, but he flew off again." "Your dad's got the cage. He's put it by the gate." Mr. Wilton looked at his watch. "We better be going too." Lucinda started to cry again. "What about Sonny?" "What about Sonny?" echoed Lucy, looking worried. It was then that Dee Dee heard a fluttering. He turned and looked up. Something green and yellow was zooming towards them from the sky. It landed on Dee Dee's head. "It's Sonny!" they all cried out together. Yes, it was Sonny. Mr. Wilton fetched the cage. Sonny hopped into the door of the cage and onto his perch. They could hardly believe Sonny was back. And just in time. "Sonny came back because you were kind to him, Dee Dee," Mrs. Wilton exclaimed. Everyone was smiling. But the time had come to say goodbye to Dee Dee. Lucinda and Lucy gave him a big hug. "I wish you could come with us," Lucinda told him. "I wish that too," Lucy agreed. Mr. and Mrs. Wilton thanked him for helping with the budgerigar and for going to the hospital. "And," Mr. Wilton added, "we're going to buy a proper cage for Sonny when we get to Dorchester." "It's been good to meet you, Dee Dee," said Mrs. Wilton. "We must be going now. Bye-bye." Fred and Jim had already started on their way in the van. "Bye-bye, Dee Dee," shouted to them as they all drove off. Mr. and Mrs. Wilton, Lucinda and Lucy waved him. "Bye, Dee Dee," they called. The Dorset dumpling suddenly remembered his friends at Walworth Cove. He better go down the road and get back to them. What a story he'll have to tell them. It had been quite an adventure, but he'd never forget Sonny, the beautiful green and yellow budgerigar. The end.